Well, hi, everybody. This is Brunch with Brent again. It's a super treat. I'm here with Allan Jude. Hi, Allan.
Hello.
Hello. So you've been kind enough to invite me into your home studio to have a conversation, which is a big treat for me. We both call the same province our home province, which is kind of a treat. So we're north of the border for this one in Canada, which is nice. So thanks for having me here. So let's get right into it. I guess for those who don't know Allan, you are a little bit everywhere. I'm kind of amazed at all the different things you end up squeezing into your days. So I would say many of us know you from BSDNow. You've been co-hosting that for eons, it seems.
Yes, 320-ish episodes probably by the time this comes out.
Right, which that's a few. That's a few. I don't know if you can do the math. We
started in 2013 and we've had an episode come out every single week without ever missing one since we started in early 2013.
That's huge.
Yeah, and for the first while I was also doing another podcast every week as well.
So not new to podcasting, that's for sure. And we'll get into that, but also super involved in FreeBSD, right?
Yes. I started using FreeBSD, I guess, 2001 or so.
Wow.
Mostly because I was into IRC and I wanted to host my own server. And somebody told me, to do that, you need to have a shell account. And I was like, what is that? Well, it all started actually with, I told somebody I wanted to run my own server. And they're like, all right, well, here's a link to go download the software. And they sent me the link, and it's a .tar.gz file. But, WinRAR opens that on my Windows 98 machine, so sure. So I download and open it, and it's got a bunch of files, and there's a README and so on, but there's no exe file. I'm like, how do you run this? And they're like, oh, you don't run it on Windows. Like, there's a thing other than Windows? Like, it's not a DOS program. What do you mean?
That's when your world just expanded, right?
Yeah. And they're like, well, no, you need to run on this... you need a shell account to do it. I'm like, oh, what's that? And I get into it. And I remember even in the very beginning thinking that Linux was spelled Lunix, L-Unix, as in it was just, this knockoff version of Unix. And it was for lunatics. That was later.
You don't still feel that way, do you?
Yes. And so I got my first shell account and I learned the basics of like, using CD and stuff was fairly similar to Windows, although, Windows, it was less specific about things like you need a space between the CD and the directory, and a little bit like that. But, because I had grown up with the command line and then only later got into Windows 3.1 and then Windows 95 and so on, I had always been familiar at least with the command line. So, swapping out dir for ls with an alias file that somebody had done by default already had helped me there. And then I learned about tar and how to extract the archives. Wasn't that hard because I had used zip and rar and arg archivers on the command line on DOS before. So it was really almost exactly the same concept.
You just sort of had to translate those concepts to
exactly. Command line arguments and stuff weren't foreign to me. The one weird one with tar is that you have to specify the file with -f rather than just being standalone.
Right.
And I think the biggest one that catches people out on that is, you put this bunch of letters in front of the, tar minus blah, blah, blah. And you have to be very careful that the F is the last one because F takes something after it, whereas the other ones don't. And, when I was teaching it, sometimes I would specifically do each flag separately instead of condensed just so that it would make more sense to people. I'm going to extract the archive. I either want verbose or not. I usually don't because just spamming my terminal with a list of files isn't helpful. And then specifying the compressor is actually redundant on BSD tar because BSD tar can look at the file and just figure it out.
I see, okay.
So you don't actually have to put the Z or the J or
petty
whatever.
Humans, right?
Yeah. Or whatever. And then the file and so on. So I learned to untar this software and then do the whole /configure make or whatever. Of course, you didn't do make install because you're not root on this machine. And a lot of them had a configure script spelled with a capital C.
Oh, gosh.
Which is, your introduction to the fact that Unix is case sensitive. Yep. That basically wrote the config.h file, which had you configured some basically compile time options before you run the configure script.
So I have a question actually. I'm curious about a little bit earlier than that, because you mentioned you had a bunch of command line experience in Windows, but how did you come to that experience?
So my very first computer was a 486 DX2, 66 megahertz, with what turned out to be an absolutely epic amount of memory, 32 megabytes.
Yeah.
So when the machine arrived so it was basically my cousin's old machine. He worked at one of the big banks here, CIBC, and he had upgraded the system to about as much as you could. And I think it was just when the Pentiums were just brand new.
Mm-hmm.
So he had got a Pentium, and so he basically sold me his 486, which was still plenty good at the time. For example, when it arrived at my house, when he brought it, it still had 48 megabytes of memory in it. Which just even that was like ludicrous. Like a brand new Pentium you bought usually came with 8 and would max out at 16.
Right.
But this thing was a compact that had this daughter board you could just fill with RAM. It just had
Awesome.
more RAM slots than anybody had ever seen. So he's like, but yeah, the top 16 megs of RAM in this belong to the bank, so I can't give you those. So I was down to 32, but it was fine. And it had Windows NT 4 on it, I think, or 3. It would have been 3.51 or whatever. Anyway, reformatted it and put DOS 6.22 on it. And I think Windows 3.1 right away. But I still did a lot of stuff in the command line. And he taught me about the command line. He did a bunch of extra setup on it that I didn't understand at the time, but over time I read it and learned it. So we had I guess it would have been a config.sys or an autoexec.bat that had a menu.
Okay.
So you could tell, when you booted up the computer, you told it what you wanted to do on the computer. In particular, if you wanted to play games, it would disable the second floppy drive to give you more memory in the below 640K area.
Nice.
And it would, but it would still load the CD-ROM driver and a couple other things. Whereas if I was going to copy floppies between my two floppy drives, I wanted both drives active. And so it had like 3 options for basically what kind of work you want to do on the computer and would reconfigure the memory for it.
So it sounds like from the start, really like configuration and customizing your experience was...
So I didn't understand any of that at the time. It was just,
but it sounds like you had a mentor really who was sort of doing this.
My problem was my mentor lived like an hour away.
That's a problem.
I didn't get to see him very often. And when I did, I was like extracting every little bit of information out of him that I could. But a lot of it was just down to exploring by myself and so on. And, lots of blunders and so on. Like when I tried to use...
one of the best ways to learn.
Double space or whatever to get more space out of the hard drives by compressing. It was the transparent compression, but it was terrible and slow and really hard to undo.
Did you lose some stuff?
Oh yeah. So the machine had a 500 megabyte Seagate drive and a 400 megabyte Connor drive. Both
two drives, nice. Yeah.
Both
okay.
And then externally, it had a 1.7x CD-ROM drive, which is like this, like a foot and a bit long. And instead of the drawer, it had these caddies. So basically it looked like a jewel case. And you opened it and you put the CD in. And then the bottom had this like 1.5 inch wide metal slider, like a floppy disk that slid out of the way to let the laser read the CD.
Crazy.
So it had 2 of these. And it was almost like you stuck the whole jewel case in the CD drive. And it was 1.7x. So it wasn't 2x, but it could read a little bit faster in real time. And then on top of that, there was an Adaptec tape drive. And I had like 3 tapes for it. And I did backups, although I don't think I ever did a restore. And then a 14.4 modem. So on top of the computer with all of its guts, there were 3 separate devices on the side. And SCSI meant there was this really fat, inflexible cable that came out of the back of the computer, went into the CD drive. Then another cable came out of a second port on the CD drive and went into the tape deck. And then eventually the last device in the chain had this terminator with a green light on it that would turn the signal around and make it go back the other way. And then each of those devices has this little up-down buttons and a number, kind of like the odometer in your car, but only 1 digit. And you'd have to program them to be on different channels so that they wouldn't conflict with each other.
Of course, yeah. We've come a long way.
Yes.
And so that experience, now to move sort of forward, kind of led to your initial interest in BSD. And that just hasn't stopped since, it sounds like.
So I got into IRC because my other mentor became my neighbor, who mostly was just a gamer.
That's a little bit closer, right? Less than an hour.
Mostly just a gamer, but was early into the internet and told me about this thing called IRC. And he was on some IRC server that was in his friend's basement, but I didn't understand that yet. He just told me, I'm on this IRC server, it's in Vancouver. So I download an IRC client, look at the server list, and pick the very first one that says Vancouver, which happened to be this network called Afternet that didn't have very many people on it, but it turned out to be a reasonable place to get started because it wasn't so big as the big ones where, it would be hard to talk to people. And so I got started on a slightly smaller, friendlier network. But eventually I learned a bit about how that worked. I was on their virus busters team. So there was this virus that specifically went after MIRC, the client. It was called DM Setup. And we would find people who were infected with this on the IRC network, and we would help them uninstall the virus, basically. Basically anti-malware before that was actually a thing. So I did that, and then eventually got into running my own IRC server, and that led into, so there's this concept called services, where there's this basically a bot that has super user privileges and can do things like give away access. And those work by connecting as a fake server. And then a lot of the restrictions that server imposes on a client don't apply when another server says something, you just believe them. So that led to writing stuff in the MIRC scripting language, because that was my intro to programming, basically.
Okay.
I guess before the internet, in the BBS days, I'd done a little bit of QBasic, because I managed to get a pirated copy of QBasic and a couple of example apps. So I'd done basic things like, what's your name? How old are you?
Yeah.
And then write a sentence based on it and so on.
Right.
I think the most complicated thing I ever did was try to write a math solving program for these math problems our teacher would give us in grade 8 or whatever. They're called Ordo. But basically you would get like 5 numbers or 4 or 5 numbers and then another number. And you had to apply whatever mathematical operations in whatever order on those numbers to get the final number as an answer.
I see.
Right? So it was like this plus that minus just some combination. So I wrote a QBasic program that would just brute force it and try every combination and spit out one that was an answer. So I would always get the points at the end of the
That's awesome.
week.
And so was it faster than you at figuring them out?
Oh, hell yeah.
Okay.
I wasn't brute forcing usually, but yes, the brute force computer program, there are only you're going to maybe brackets, but basically add, subtract, multiply, or divide, or exponentiate a number with the other numbers to get the answer. And in every order, There
are quite a few permutations, really, when you got 4 or 5 numbers.
Computers can do how many of those permutations per second?
Right? Yeah.
Versus me? I don't know why I was thinking about this problem recently. I think it was just I woke up early and stupid things that go through your head when you're trying to go back to sleep. And I was like, I could rewrite that program so much more elegantly now because I'm so much smarter. And I'm like, but why? If my grade 8 math problems are not something I should be thinking about right now, why can't I go back to sleep?
It's funny, our childish brains are still in our, they're still us, right?
Yeah. Anyway, so then the next big programming I did was writing stuff in the MIRC scripting language. And eventually first started with just a bot that connected as a user. And when you type things in chat room that started with exclamation mark, whatever, it would detect that and do something. But eventually I'm like, I want it to be more powerful. So connect as a server is when I started to learn protocols. So actually speaking the server-to-server language. And I also learned how to, using Telnet, send an email with a fake from address.
Right.
And things like that. And so that led into more. And then eventually I got Visual Basic 6 and started writing applications for that, almost all network-based, doing stuff with sockets. I wrote my own chat thing originally, and then eventually that turned into an IRC client. And then I wrote a services thing. But some terrible hacks in there, like Visual Basic 6 didn't really have the concept of dynamic arrays. You could only do fixed size arrays. Oh. So I used a hidden list box as my array.
Oh, man.
So when it first connected and had to fill that list box, it was really slow because it was doing the animations even though it wasn't on screen. And I was just like, this is terrible. I should probably learn how to do this properly. What I really wanted was a hash with a key, but the list box operator had a way to be like, give me the index of the object that has this number. And so there'd be one list box that was the name and it would map to the index. And then a second list box, you use the same index and it would have the value. And it was basically making a hash by using 2 list boxes. It was terrible.
But it's how you could figure out how to do what you did.
And I learned more and more programming as I went.
Right.
So that's what I got into IRC. And I eventually wanted to run my own server. So I got a shell account. And the first one I got was from this little little provider guy. I think he was running it out of his house. He was paying AT&T a ransomish amount of money for a T1. So it's like 1.5 megabits.
Right.
But I had 33.6 dial-up at the time, so that was fast. It was called lucida.qc.ca or something like that. It was in Quebec. But eventually he was getting DDoS attacks, and AT&T wasn't willing to block them or at least even give him a break on the bandwidth cost of it. Because I think he was paying 95th percentile. So like he had the whole T1, but he wasn't paying a flat rate for it. So the usage would matter. And
the
DDoS attacks eventually basically put him out of business. So then I went to another one, and that one went out of business due to incompetence. And I went to another one, and that was just poorly run.
Gosh.
And I was just like,
I see where this is going.
This is annoying. It's like, I could do this better myself. So this was, I think, the last year of high school, or maybe the second to last year of high school. And at high school, they were just talking about that they had this Ontario government thing called Summer Company. You'd write up a business plan and so on and submit it. And 5 students would get paid, get $2,000 to start a business, run it for the summer, and you had to take these classes. If you passed the classes, you'd get another $2,000 at the end of the summer. So even if your business didn't make any money, you would still have the $2,000 as a reward. But if it did, then you got to keep all that money and the $2,000 reward.
Yeah, right. That's incentive.
So I applied for that, but this is 2001 or 2002, so just after the .com crash. Obviously, none of these people understood what IRC was or why people would want to host IRC servers. And so it was just hosting. And then it was like, yeah, there are lots of web hosts around. That's not going to be a thing. So I made it to the top 10 and had the interviews with the people from the banks and so on that were the judges for this, but didn't get selected for the top 5 that actually got the money. But I had this whole business plan that I'd come up with and all the stuff. And so my parents are like, well, we can loan you $1,000 to try.
All right.
And so they did. And we bought our first machine with it. My friend had a company building computers that I helped him out with. And so we cobbled together the cheapest server we could. It was like an AMD 1700 Plus, an old beat up case and power supply that we got off eBay really cheap. Only 256 megs of RAM, which was a reasonable amount, but not a lot. And like an 80 gig hard drive or something like that.
But that's all you needed.
Yeah. And that's the first time I installed FreeBSD on an actual machine.
Oh, okay.
And set it up and basically had to learn to sysadmin it because, there's one thing to sysadmin a machine where you're running a web server or something. It's different to sysadmin a machine when other people are paying you to have shell access to the machine and run their own programs on it.
Yes.
You really have to learn to lock things down and understand how permissions work. I'm not actually sure exactly how I learned like the octal permissions and what they meant and how to set them. I did at some point. And like I remember explaining it to people later on when I was teaching, but I'm not sure how I learned a lot of this stuff. It kind of just
sounds
happened
like a lot
organically.
Of it. Yeah, that's it, right? A lot of it you learn just through necessity because you're going down this path and it's like, well, I need to be learning this right now because that's where I am right now. It sounds also like you're really motivated by like self-learning. Would that be accurate?
A lot.
Yeah.
It was mostly, I like I recommend to people when they want to learn stuff is pick a project you want to do and then just kind of learn the pieces as you go. And so you don't want to pick something too complicated because you can easily, get in too deep and then you feel stuck or that you're not succeeding. But just iterative things, kind of worked for me. But different people learn different ways too. So
of course. Yeah, of course. I really kind of connect with your way of kind of having a goal and just diving in, even though at that point you may not have any idea what you're talking about. But you're going to learn something along the way, whether it succeeds or not, right? So that's really valuable.
Like programming, I learned a lot from reading the source code of other people's examples. So websites like Planet Source Code, which I don't think is still around, but it was a huge collection of Visual Basic 6 examples on how to do stuff. Or entire applications, but oftentimes just snippets. And just learning kind of those idioms and stuff was helpful. Then one of the crazier things I did was at first when we were running the IRC servers, we also ran them on Windows on my home computers as well. We didn't really understand how you compiled Unix code to work on Windows. It was complicated, but somebody just give you this exe and it worked. When we wanted to change some of the messages, we learned about these tools called hex editors.
Yes.
And they go into the exe and change the string.
Yeah.
But if your string was suddenly going to be a different length,
you
could run into problems.
I understand.
You obviously couldn't keep going because you would overwrite bytes or change. You couldn't change the byte positions. So this often meant slightly weird wording and trying to make it fit in the same length as the original
extra
one.
Spaces.
You could put extra spaces at the end or whatever, but some of that, and that often led to crashing because, not understanding that the strings are null terminated and that part's important, that last thing that looks like a space is not a space, it's the null terminator. And if you lose that, then the string is just going to keep going and bad things are going to happen.
That sounds like a true hack to try to get it going.
A little bit later on, got into actually using Unix for the IRC servers and editing the source code. And then you could change the strings as much as you wanted. And then I got into, I've done a little bit of programming in a bunch of different languages now. I've done a tiny bit of Perl, a little bit of PHP, Visual Basic, etc. I can read ifs and whiles and fors and so on. And so now I'm like changing little bits of the IRC server or like adding an extra command and figuring out how that worked. But I didn't really understand pointers and the difference between a pointer and the struct itself. And that led to some crashing and so on. But implemented some extra features in the IRC server, stuff like a command I could do that would cause the server to flood a specific user, make their connection not work, and stuff like that. Or just like give myself super user privileges. You do this, then there's just an if in a bunch of the different places where it checks if you have access. And it's like, oh, if this flag is set, it's Allan, and Allan can do anything.
Nice.
Like change other people's names and stuff.
There's a benefit to being the owner of the system, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's got me into Unix. And then I got more and more into FreeBSD as I was having this first server and then a second server and on. The shell provider made a profit over its operational costs starting the first month. So that was good.
Wow.
We made enough money to pay for the co-location of the server. And then as it grew, we were able to pay back my parents. I think I paid back about half and they forgave the rest as a present or whatever.
As parents do.
Yes. But, I managed to grow that and it paid for college and everything for me.
Amazing.
I shuttered it in 2012, I think, about 10 years after it started. Because, back then we could get away with charging people $15 to have access to basically, to be one of 15 people on a server that had 256 or 512 megs of RAM,
yes,
and one IP address and some stuff. Nowadays, for that much money, you can get a much better virtual machine to yourself where you have root.
But I mean, that was how long ago, right?
Yeah.
So
back in 2003, 2004, etc. Virtual machines weren't really a thing.
Mm-hmm.
There was no accelerated virtualization. So if you had a virtual machine, it was really slow. And yes, if you wanted a whole server, you're talking hundreds of dollars a month, very limited bandwidth and so on. So yes, paying me $15 was a much better solution. And you got a system actually managed by somebody that knew what they were doing.
Right.
And all you had to do was run your 3 programs or whatever. You didn't have to worry about OS updates and stuff like that. And so
tell me how that led to the room we're sitting in now, right? Because it has progressed into quite something else.
Yeah. So the shell provider I kept doing when I went, so I started that when I was 17. I started when I was 16 and I just kept going from there. So the year I turned 17, I started it earlier in the year. Then when I went to college, I met some other people and I started looking a little bit more at consulting, building websites and web applications and stuff. I guess near the end of high school, I did one other project, which is where I learned PHP and MySQL. It was a local hardware supply company. They had a paper catalog of all their products. When I was in high school, CD burners were relatively rare. So in my high school of 600 students, there were 2, mine and this other kid named Jeff. Jeff lived in the bigger town, so he had cable and I only had dial-up. So Jeff specialized in music. So you give him a playlist and he would download the songs and put them on a CD or whatever. And so I specialized in PlayStation games because my neighbor knew a guy that could do mod chips. And so I basically, because my internet wasn't fast, but I could go and rent PlayStation games and then copy them.
Right.
And I had all the right stuff for it. I did that. So that's how I met Jeff. But eventually, so Jeff was also into photography and stuff. And so he was actually taking the pictures of the products and to do this print magazine.
I see.
And he had got the job of building a website there wasn't actually going to be e-commerce, but it would let people browse the products and have the product number or whatever and be able to call and order stuff. And so he basically subcontracted me to actually build the website part of it. For the company was called Charles Jones or something like that. And they made like ridiculous things, like the tools you use to do live power lines on the telephone poles. So it was like the gloves they used to like hold on to the wires and like the special plastic guards they put around them when they're re-putting them on new telephone poles and stuff. So it was very high industry stuff. And that basically, I said, yeah, sure, I can build this website. And I basically learned PHP and SQL as I did it. It was not a very well-built application, but the website worked fine. So it was great. So anyway, so I'd done a couple of websites and stuff like that. So in college, I met some other people, and we decided we were going to start this consulting company. And, we did like backups as a service and like going to people's offices and fixing computers and stuff like that. So as I graduated, I started doing that. It was not very successful. I had some work, so I wasn't starving, but it was, kind of feast or famine like consulting often is. And
right.
Projects always take longer than it seems like you're going to. And my main project was actually helping that friend that had the computer company build a website that did e-commerce, and he sold the computer parts. So he would get these giant Excel sheets from the 3 or 4 different suppliers he had of all the parts and like how much they cost and what category they're in. And then we build a website out of that, kind of like a Newegg or whatever.
Yeah.
And like some automated algorithms to add a percentage to the price based on the category. Like video cards, we charge a little bit more markup than we do for hard drives or whatever, and built that. So anyway, after I graduated from college, I was doing the consulting thing. It wasn't going especially well. But I had met the professor I had for Intro to Networking and then later Perl and Cisco 2 and a bunch of other things. And I had got along really well. And always talking about ideas we had for like, one idea we had was to make a service to prove your identity. So like you would send us your like pay slip and so on, and we would certify to other people that this person has a job and makes money. Or, we've seen their driver's license. This is actually, this person is who they say they are. Huh. Mostly ideas we talk about while standing around in the hallway before class or whatever.
Sometimes the best ideas come in those conversations.
But because we had so many of those conversations, we got along really well. And then in, I guess, November of 2008, he called me and he was like, so my wife is pregnant and I'm going to take paternity leave because I can get paid like 80% of my salary to basically remodel our house to make room for the extra kid. They need someone to teach the Unix security class that you had taken with me and, got 100%. Like I had the highest score ever in this class. And, would you like to teach it? And I'm like, I'm not very good at public speaking. When I had to give a presentation in class in college, I was shaking so bad I couldn't read the piece of paper I was holding. But he's like, well, just send them your resume and they will send back how much it pays. And I'm like, sure, okay. So I write up a resume and send it in. And they're like, yeah, so you'll start at like band 3. You'll get $74.96 an hour. And, you're teaching 2 courses. So it's a 4-hour lab class, and there are 2 different sections of it. So you'll teach the 4-hour lab one day, and then on a different day of the week, you'll teach a different set of students the same thing. So really, it's not that much prep work either.
Did the class being a lab class make it much easier for you?
Yes.
Because it's hands-on?
At Mohawk, almost all the classes, when I was a student, there was usually a lecture part and a lab part, and it slowly evolved into basically having a mini lecture in the lab because it made more sense to have a small lecture, do something in the lab in a 2-hour class, and then have a second 2-hour class where you also had another lecture and more lab, then having a 1-hour lecture in a lecture hall, and then a 3-hour lab separate. And so this one was a slightly weird just because the class was more complicated, just one big 4-hour lab, which was a bit of a slog, but at the same time, probably required because if you couldn't finish it by the end of class, there wasn't really a way to resume. Like we were reformatting the computers you were sitting at for class. And so there wasn't a good way to pick up and resume. Nowadays, students bring a laptop hard drive that connects via USB and they just pull up their VM from last week and continue. But back then that wasn't a thing. So I'm like, well, yeah, for that amount of money, sure, I'll give it a try. It's like, it's only 14 weeks. So if I hate it, after 14 weeks, I can stop doing it. And so then I moved back from the little town I was living in back into Hamilton here and started teaching these classes. I was a little nervous for the first 5 minutes, but, hey, it's Unix, it's BSD specifically.
Okay.
I know this. I can just, have all the confidence I need to just explain this stuff to you guys. And the class went pretty well. And I actually liked some of the students. And it was, I felt like a lot of them got it. The first class or two were a little rough. Most of these students had just come off an 8-month work term, almost all of them using only Windows. So in the first lab, when none of them could remember the flags for tar, I was like, But, and that was always one of my pet peeves was people who tried to just memorize the flags instead of understanding what they're for. It's like, if you just try to remember XVZF or whatever, you're never going to make sense of this stuff. If you know what they mean, if I want to extract the archive and it's gzipped and this is the file I want to extract, then you'll be able to figure it out every time. Or you can at least use the man page and know which flag you're looking for.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just memorize this jumble of letters, it's never going to make sense to you. Yeah,
I find for myself, like, especially the way my mind works, and I imagine for you much the same, is like I have to almost understand the system before being able to, memorizing just doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
I have to learn how it works to be able to use it. And so then flags just come naturally because you learn them through a different method, right?
Yeah, and especially in shell scripts, I do it because it's self-documenting. But even on the command line, often I'll use the long flag because that's how my brain works, right? I know what I want to do, right? So rsync -- archive because I want it to copy all the permissions and the users and stuff, and -- progress, and using the long flags just because I know what they mean. Whereas the short flags, sure, I can remember it's this bunch of them, but it just fits better in my brain to do the long way.
Right. And so did this teaching experience, like obviously it gave you more confidence with some public speaking because you were kind of a little bit freaked out about that.
After a couple of weeks of that, I was like, oh, turns out this isn't that bad.
Right.
And I think about week 3 or 4, they asked me, hey, I know you're teaching 8 hours of class a week right now. This summer, we have 12 hours of class that you can teach, and they're easier classes. It was like Microsoft Admin 1, Intro to TCP IP, and Intro to Unix. So it's, instead of 6th semester classes, it was 2nd semester classes because it was summer because people started in January. And I'm like, yeah, I've already moved back here. Why not? It's I'll get an apartment instead of living in student housing, and yeah, sure.
Was it kind of tricky though to do the less technical stuff?
Not really. The weird one in the summer was a little weird because it was actually the same 40 students. I was teaching 3 of their 5 classes they were taking that semester.
Crazy.
So they had like a math class, an English class, and some other, and then they had like mainframes and one other class that was taught by some other guy. But I basically, oftentimes it would result in like, all right, we're doing a 2-hour lab here on this subject. Then we'll go to the room next door and have a 2-hour lab on a different subject.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so it's like Microsoft class, 2 hours later, and then at the end of that 2 hours, move to the next room over and have a 2-hour Unix class.
You probably got quite close with some of these people. I imagine you're spending lots of time with them.
As I kept teaching after that, a lot of them ended up having me more. To the point where when they were practicing for their final practical Cisco exam, they managed to con me into coming in on a Saturday because I had keys to unlock the room and let them basically do a trial run of their practical lab for the Cisco class.
Nice.
And I was also the faculty supervisor for the movie club at the college. So I think Thursday night, we'd take over one of the lecture halls and play terrible 80s movies.
Why not, right?
Yeah, it was quite a bit of fun. And some of the students I met from that, because, they're basically my age, are still people I hang out with.
All right.
So, I had my birthday party last month, and
some of them were
a bunch
there.
of my best friends are people I met.
That's cool.
Way.
Well, you obviously...
Some of them I never had as students. Though I think the very first day of class was actually weird. So when I got this, the job offer, and I knew I was only going to be working for 3 months at this time, I called up the landlord when I was in college. I lived off campus, and basically I rented one room out of a house. And the landlord rented the second room to my best friend, and the third room to his cousin, and the fourth room to some random guy. And we lived there. And over time, the random guy cycled out a bunch of times. But anyway.
So literally random.
Yes. So when I needed basically temporary housing, it was I needed a place for these 3 months. I don't want to sign a 1-year lease for an apartment. And it was in January. And since the semester normally starts in September, oftentimes people will drop out or something and land on an empty room in one of the couple of houses he has, and he would be able to give me a short-term lease. So I called him up and he's like, actually, I have the room beside the room you lived in when you lived here is available right now. I'm like, sure, that'll work. Plus, that one's green, whereas the one I had originally was pink. So, so I had that room, and he rented to other students for the other rooms. So taught the first day of class and walk home from the college. It was like 4 or 5 minute walk. That's one of the reasons why I rented that place, because it was so close to school. I walk in the door and I'm taking my shoes off and stuff. And about 2 minutes later, behind me walks in one of the students. He's definitely not one of the roommates, because I've met all the roommates already.
Okay.
And I'm like, dude, what are you following me home for? It's like, what? You live here? he was friends with the guy that lived across the hall from me, right. Matt. And so, one of the kids from my class hung out at my house a lot because he hung out with Mike or Matt, who lived across the hall from me.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. So that was weird.
And so fast forward, and you had those teaching experiences.
Yeah. So I taught for about 3 years. Then the one summer, they only had 4 hours of coursework for me. And it was what's called a service course. So it was the IT department teaching a course in some other faculty. So it was like database fundamentals for the like secretarial courses or something. And I taught that one once before, and it was really annoying because the practical part made sense. It was Microsoft Access for secretaries, building forms to fill out databases and stuff. But it also had a lecture component in a lecture hall that was like IBM mainframe database design.
Weird.
Like about, the fix with fields and data types and stuff, none of which had any applicability to these students at all. And so the written exam was always a slog of just these poor people who just want to be secretaries, having to learn all this database theory that was zero applicability to them. And I didn't really enjoy that, teaching that, because, the students were not really interested in it.
Doesn't sound like it was their fault.
Exactly. And so I'm like, I'll just take the summer off, because I've taught continuously every semester without a break at this point. So I taught 7 or 8 semesters or something like that. So I took a summer off. And around that time is when ScaleEngine, the video streaming company, which wasn't a video streaming company yet, was finally getting to the point where it could afford to pay me to work full time. And so I got to focus on that for a couple of months. But come September, I went back to teaching. But found that I was really not enjoying it very much anymore, because I was basically teaching the same courses I had taught 3 or 4 times already, and the students were getting less and less interested every time. Like that first cohort of students I had was very close in age to me. Like they had started around when I was finishing and so on. And so, they were the type of students who grew up without a computer at home and eventually got one, and it was interesting and they want to learn all about it or whatever. Whereas when I transitioned to teaching students that were just starting out, they were getting to the point where, there had just always been a computer at home, and it was like the TV. You turned it on,
it's an appliance.
Comes out and you turn it off, and you don't really care how it works. It like floored me when this one student be like, I bought a DVD burner and I don't know how to install it in my computer. I'm like, you're in 4th semester of this sysadmin course. How is like, oh, right. People don't take their computers apart anymore. It's like, what? This person bought, when I was in school, anybody in the class would have been embarrassed to admit they bought their computer at a store rather than built it themselves. And these guys is like, weren't embarrassed to admit they had never opened their computer.
Oh, so things have clearly changed.
Yeah.
Obviously.
And so the level of interest in, there's just like, command line's scary, I don't want to do that and stuff. And it was just so, teaching a class of 35 to 40 students about Unix, and there are 4 of them who actually care, just started to grate on me a little bit.
Of course. So time to move on, right?
Yeah, and I had ScaleEngine was starting to take off.
So tell me a little bit more about ScaleEngine. Your co-founder?
Yes. So my co-founder was that professor I had mentioned.
Okay.
So when I was doing consulting, we had traded off with each other and doing, I'm going on vacation, cover for me for a couple of weeks or whatever. His focus was mostly email and SEO, because his degree is actually in linguistics, not computers. So he wrote a bunch of Perl scripts that would change the language on the website on a regular basis, but make sure that A versus an and things like that were always correct.
That's fascinating.
and had just learned all the stuff about the Google algorithm and be able to. So he did like Insurance Hotline and a bunch of these other websites that were, trying to sell car insurance, whatever. He'd done SEO for them. Whereas I was more on the hosting and Unix side. He had some Unix stuff, like I said, mail servers and stuff, but his focus had been email and SEO, and mine was more the hosting side. And we had gotten together, and then, so he called me about doing this teaching for him. After he came back, after his paternity leave was over, we started hanging out more and talking more, and we decided to combine our consulting companies and work together. So we started what was called Near Source IT, which is basically the opposite of outsourcing, basically. Or it was outsourcing, but to a near shore instead of a far one.
Right.
We went looking for office space, mostly because when Stefan was working at home, his wife at the time would come home from work and be like, "You were home all day. Why is the vacuuming not done?"
Oh, yeah.
Well, I was working.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So he's like, "If I have an office somewhere, I'll leave the house and it'll make more sense." Didn't work. But anyway, so we had this office. We were looking for office space. And one of the places we looked was the back room of this bubble tea cafe near Stefan's house.
No way.
We're like, it'd be a fine place to work, but it wouldn't be a good place to try to invite clients to or something.
Unless they like bubble tea.
We had visions of actually inviting clients over, although in our actual office, we almost never did. But we're like, this would be great. So this bubble tea cafe had all the board games and stuff. It's like, this would be great for an internet gaming cafe. Set up a bunch of computers and have computer games that people pay by the hour. Like there was one of these at the college when I was a student, but it had shut down at some point. We're like, it'd be really cool for that. But bootstrapping it would take a bunch of money, and we'd have to pay someone to sit here all the time because we can't do it because we're teaching. That won't work. But after 2 days of thinking about it and so on, I'm like, what if we could automate it? So I sat down in Visual Basic and wrote a bunch of software that would basically do the kiosk type system on the computer. And you log into the XP machine with the username and password from our website, which is validated against LDAP running on a FreeBSD server using Samba to pretend to be a Windows NT4 domain controller, because the Samba 4 wasn't out yet, and Windows XP could connect to an old NT4 domain controller that Samba could simulate. And it would apply a bunch of group policies, although they were hard to manage back then because you had to actually make a registry.dat file that it would apply rather than actual group policy type stuff, because it was Windows NT4 group policies.
Right.
But we disabled a bunch of stuff. And it would log you out when you ran out of time. And then if you just went to the cashier at the bubble tea cafe, give them your username and pay them money, they will type it in on a laptop we set up for them, and it would add money into your account, and you could continue to play games.
Nice.
And we got a Steam Cafe license, which I didn't know was a thing, but we paid $10 a month per machine, and we got all the Valve games and 100 other games.
Wow, really?
Most of the 100 other games were like the PopCap things, like Bejeweled, so they weren't that useful. But having Left 4 Dead when that first came out, and like Call of Duty, or not Call of Duty, Counter-Strike and a bunch of that stuff, and we installed WoW on all the machines.
Okay.
And, especially with Left 4 Dead being this 4-player co-op thing, it was attractive to have all 4 people in the same room to be able to do this. So we ended up doing that, and we bought a bunch of machines that looked like that.
And so how many machines are we talking?
We bought 5.
Okay.
And then we had a junker machine that ran the domain controller, because it also did a thing. It had a screen on it, because you could use the web browser on it to sign up for an account and pay with a credit card. Okay,
that makes sense.
In the cafe as well. So that, again, the idea was not requiring any staff. That didn't really go very well. And we eventually did find an office and rent it. So as I quit teaching, I got sucked in by one of the other professors at the college into this startup incubator thing they were doing. It wasn't really a startup thing, but they had government grant money to use students to help businesses improve their automation and stuff. So they had done one with the Ferrero Rocher plant in Brentford and improved the efficiency by 15% by getting a bunch of students from the process automation class, improving the conveyor belt systems and so on. And so I got tapped for this project. It was a board game called Outsmart, which was this weird cross between Trivial Pursuit and poker.
I can't picture it.
So there are trivia questions, and each question has at least 6 right answers. So you roll, whoever's turn it is rolls the dice, and it comes up with a number, and everybody writes down that many right answers.
I see.
And then you play them like poker cards, and you only get a point if yours hasn't been used up.
Crazy.
So you're mostly playing against the other people like most of the trivia questions were designed not to be hard. And also, there's only so many questions that have 6 right answers. And so like my favorite example question was all of the words from the Peter Piper nursery rhyme that start with the letter P. So basically, everybody should know most of these, if not all the answers. But you can only write down 4 because that's what the dice came up with this time. So you write down 4. But you want to be like, well, if I'm going first, do I want to use Peter right away so nobody else can get it? Or is everybody else going to not pick Peter because they think I'm going to use it first?
Yeah, it's a psychological
and so
thing.
maybe I'll use it, but I won't say it first. I'll use up one of the other ones to steal somebody's point. Yeah. It's kind of okay. I have a box copy upstairs somewhere. It never sold that well. But the idea, this is 2010-ish. So Facebook games are all the rage. So we're going to convert this to a Facebook game. You can write the back end and then we'll get some Flash studio to make a nice front end for it. And it'll make tons of money. So I worked on that project and I wrote this whole back end for it. Is my first real experience with doing the proper software design lifecycle stuff, like doing all the planning and the flow charts before you actually write the code. Worked out really nice.
A new skill.
So I wrote all the back end for this, but then they kind of never came through with the money to get a studio to write the front end.
Oh no!
So we hired a co-op student to write a simple like jQuery engineering web interface, so we could actually play the game and try it and make sure all the rules worked and so on. Because we had to deal with some stuff like, turns out when you're doing this in person, you don't have to necessarily spell the word exactly right. But if we're going to have this game play online and the computer has to judge, spelling's going to count. And, web browsers didn't have built-in spell checkers and stuff yet then. Okay. So we had to like come up with this way of like getting common misspellings for most of the answers to know if they were right and so on. Anyway, so we hired this co-op student and he mostly worked while I was gone after I finished with this task. So it was, here's all the code Allan wrote, use it and build a front end. And that went from there. So during that semester, after I finished teaching, but while I was working at the startup incubator, we had ScaleEngine, which was mostly doing large-scale hosting. So we hosted forums and things like that had scalability problems. Okay. So we hosted, that's also how I got involved with JB, which I guess I'll tell that story in a second. Sure. But we hosted big forums like hackintosh.org, because that's where you learned how to root an iPhone. Yeah. And so they would have huge traffic spikes. I met them because my shell provider had hosted their IRC server forever. And so they wanted me to host a website. And at one point it was like 3 whole servers dedicated to the website and it was falling over all the time because it was still, Apache and MySQL and so on. So with ScaleEngine, we had invented this better system of basically a grid computing kind of thing, we called it. But we used FreeBSD jails and ZFS. And we weren't using ZFS yet, but FreeBSD jails and so on. And we split the load up and did it all well. And so we hosted hackintosh.org, MangaShare, Jupiter Broadcasting's forum, and a couple other things. And it was doing pretty well. But the MangaShare one was all these giant JPEGs. And they were starting to hurt our bandwidth quotas. So we were at Mountain Cable, the local cable ISP. We had half a rack as a colocation. And while we could burst to a gigabit, we were only paying for like 20 megabits. And if we went over that, if 95% of the time we weren't under 20 megabits, we had to pay extra. So having people downloading all these big JPEGs during prime time was starting to be a problem. And they had also complained that, people in Europe were having slower downloads. So we rented 2 servers, one in Seattle and one in Germany, and rsynced a copy of all the JPEGs over to them and made subtle changes to the website so they would use a different DNS name to load the images. And so now the images would come to these 2 dedicated servers that were instead of having the bandwidth quota based on the number of megabits, it was you can send 10 terabytes a month. And so we offloaded these images into these 2 servers and basically over time accidentally and created a CDN. Oops. And so that grew. And then this company called NRelate, which made a related content plugin for WordPress, but not a clickbaity junk one. It was no words, just a picture of a product. And if you clicked on it, it would take you to go buy it. So like if the article was talking about shoes, it would have like a picture of a Nike and you click it and whatever. It was like Outbrain or any of those other clickbaity things, except for not junky clickbait, actual products you might want to buy that were actually related to the content. And they grew to the point where they were doing like 5 billion transactions a month on us, like downloading 5 billion images.
Holy, yeah.
And so we had to massively expand.
Yeah.
And like we had servers doing thousands of requests a second out of memory with Varnish. And we huged up our CDN, added lots and lots of servers. And we had to improve our GeoDNS system. So at the time we were using Bind, the typical DNS server, it had what were called views, which were mostly meant to do a split horizon thing of like inside my network, the website resolves to the internal IP of the web server, and outside it resolves to the outside IP. But we used that with a giant summarized set of subnets to break the world up into like 8 regions.
No way.
And so Bind would use like 2 gigs of memory and take like 10 minutes to reload the config. It was terrible.
Oh, man.
And eventually we replaced that with this app called GDNSD, which was written by a developer at Logitech to geographically distribute their driver downloads. And it did basically the same job, but much, much, much better as we switched to that. And so ScaleEngine was finally getting big, and I was now working on it full time almost. We were still doing the consulting thing on the side, and we had this one customer that was building an interview system. So it was basically when you submit your resume to work at this bank, you would also use your webcam to attach a 5-minute video kind of introduction of yourself.
Got it.
And the bank could then use this to screen people based on language skills and just presentability and so on. Before they would do like a phone interview with you and before an in-person interview. And for this, we had got a copy of this video server software called Wowza. So then one day we get an email from this random radio station in Finland called spin.fm. And they wanted to do a live stream of their DJ, like mixing the music or whatever, and put this on their website. And we're like, well, we're basically a static CDN. We mostly only deliver JPEGs and CSS files and so on. But we have a copy of this video server software that we were using to test this thing for a client. Sure, we'll throw it on our server in Germany and set this up, and you can have this live stream. And it worked, and worked quite well, and we were happy with it. And then one day they got more than 100 people watching at once. And the stream was about 1 megabit. And the server had a 100 megabit connection to the internet.
Yeah.
And so when you had over 100 people, all of them would get buffering. See, when you're doing like downloads of, say, like the podcast episodes, when we were hosting the podcast downloads for Jupiter Broadcasting, if you hit the maximum bandwidth of the server, everybody's download just goes a little bit slower. They probably don't notice. Everybody's happy. Video streaming, as soon as you get near the limit, everybody's stream starts buffering.
Everybody notices. Yeah.
Yes. So we had to upgrade that server to a gigabit and buy a second server in France with a gigabit and another copy of the server software. And then, eventually video streaming took over everything. And we basically stopped doing the CDN stuff except for the Jupiter Broadcasting downloads.
Oh, cool. And so now ScaleEngine is just focusing on the video stuff.
Yeah.
And is quite a bit bigger.
Yes. It went from just that professor and I who started the business together. Originally, it was the consulting company, and it kind of morphed into the hosting company, which then morphed into the video streaming company. And then the co-op student that we used on that Outsmart project, the game project, he had proven that he could take a bunch of code I wrote and finish it.
Which is useful.
So we hired him at ScaleEngine to improve our control panel. So we had this control panel we exposed to customers that let them control some of the stuff in their account that I had written. And it needed a lot of work, and I was busy managing all these servers and adding new servers and stuff. So we hired him as a developer, and he basically writes PHP and Java for us. PHP to improve the control panel and website and API, and then Java are modules for the video server. And then eventually we hired a sysadmin as a co-op student, and then hired him full-time when he graduated. And then this year we've had a second sysadmin in as well.
Right. So you've got a whole crew here. And but tell me like maybe 3 stats of how many servers are operating, how much data
so we
maybe?
have somewhere around 110 or 120 servers spread across 36 different data centers in 12 countries.
Wow. Okay. And lots of data, I imagine.
Yes. Huge amounts of storage. If you count the redundancy, basically everything's all the recordings of all the videos are stored on in a rack of servers in Toronto, but they're also replicated to a rack of servers in my basement here. Because basically it was a good excuse to have the offsite backups in my basement because they're easier to access if you ever need to pick them up and drive them to a data center. But it was also a great excuse to get gigabit internet at home.
Well done.
Yes.
Well, and
pushing
so maybe
petabytes of bandwidth a month.
Yeah, tons and tons, I'd imagine. Yeah. And you're still having fun doing it?
Yeah. Things have changed quite a bit over the years. Obviously, Flash mostly dried up and went away, and we switched over to HLS, HTTP live streaming, which originally was just the Apple protocol, but was pretty standard now. It was nice when browsers like Firefox finally could do it natively instead of needing a player. Things have changed a lot more recently with YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and so on giving it away for free. We've lost a lot of the smaller things like churches and community centers and city halls. And mostly now our focus is on more pay-per-view type content.
Right.
Where basically you're paying to watch it. And so they want it on a platform that provides access control and stuff like ScaleEngine does.
Right. And so you mentioned Jupiter Broadcasting in there. Maybe that's a really nice segue to talk a little bit about, well, like the serendipitous connection there, it sounds like, but also how you got really involved in that.
Yeah. So we'll start at maybe podcasting.
Sure.
So I don't know if podcasting was even technically quite a thing. I guess it was a bit of a thing at this point. Right, yes. Definitely podcasting did exist because I was watching like Dig.tv or Dig Nation and some Leo Laporte stuff and so on. So I've basically run my own IRC network since I was like 16 or 17, whenever I got the internet. And it turned out that one of the networks I linked up with was the home of the chat room for Chris Pirillo. For his like Locker Gnome or whatever it was called at the time, his online community after he had left Tech TV, which was like an actual cable channel you could subscribe to, and it would. Right. They had like a show called The Screensavers where people would call in for help when they would help them, and or no, so there was one called Call for Help that was just answering people's questions and other stuff. And for a while, that Call for Help show was hosted by this guy Chris Pirillo. But anyway, he used our IRC servers for his chat room. And around that time is when services like Ustream.tv and Justin.tv were kicking off. And at the time, Justin.tv, which basically what became Twitch, was live streaming for like these two specific people, like Justin and Justine. And I think about the 10th person or so was Chris Pirillo to get on this service. And then live streaming started to become a little bit more popular, and services like Ustream.tv popped up and Livestream.com, which I think was still called Mogulus at the time. Because Pirillo was on the West Coast, it meant that on his website, in the kind of morning hours of East Coast time, it was a live stream of his office with the lights out, which just had these things called ticks clocks. So it's a clock, and it's got like, for the hour, it's got like 3 cells and then 9 cells. And then it's the number of lights that are on in each cell that tell you the time, but it changes every couple of seconds so that it's interesting. Cool. Yeah. It looks cool, but you can tell the time from it.
Okay.
So it'd just be like those, and his monitor is dark and the lights are out in the room. So we convinced him, we built a bot that if you were on a certain approved list, if you typed a command in the chat room, it would swap out the player on the website with the Ustream URL for somebody else.
That's awesome.
So I would take over this live stream and just, basically answer questions from the chat room or yell at people or whatever was entertaining at the time. So it was kind of the beginning of live streaming and so on. And he also, most evenings, would record stuff, basically a video podcast, and post it to YouTube. And so I collaborated in those in basically what was the precursor for TechSNAP. So we'd look at news articles and then try to explain the technical aspects of it to people. Like, I think one of my favorite ones was there was one about PGP, the company that originally invented the asymmetric email encryption stuff, also made a full disk hard drive encryption thing. And the news was about it. And Chris Pirillo got it confused with PHP and was like, what does PHP have to do with hard drive encryption? So I had to explain the whole concept. But basically, when they were encrypting your hard drive, they were encrypting it to 2 keys, your key and their recovery key, so that you could always call them if you forgot your password.
Right.
Except for it turns out you could lie and recover somebody else's encrypted disk, making it not very useful.
Making it useful, yeah.
And then there was like one episode where somebody asked a question about just like, how many fans do I need to cool my computer or whatever? And
which is a complicated answer, actually.
Yeah, I had a whole diatribe about it and about like using the rubber grommets to reduce the vibrations and like how static pressure and stuff. So like how fast the fan goes versus how hard it blows and all this other stuff. So I did those. I was being put in, so it was Chris's face and he was talking to me, but I was coming in over Ventrilo or something terrible, low quality and stuff. But I did that. And our IRC network started getting used by a bunch of other podcasts and stuff because it turned out we had a good Flash-based web client so that you could embed this thing on your website and people would end up in your chat room without having to download an IRC client or know what that is. And I think it was Mike Linux NL or somebody moved Jupiter Broadcasting over to my IRC network.
Okay.
But they weren't all that big usually. But one day, I was looking, I noticed their chat room had over 1,000 people in it. I was like, that is highly unusual. I wonder if it's a bot attack or something.
So
I joined the channel to see what's going on. And one of the ops named Jeremy asked a question, which was, what is the name of Captain Porthos's Captain Archer's dog? And I answered Porthos. It wasn't cheating, but because I was on the hub, my answer would probably have shown up on his screen sooner than anyone else's.
You're right.
And then they're like, Allan wins. I'm like, I win what? And it was actually, they were doing a giveaway for closed beta invites for Star Trek Online.
Okay.
Because Jupiter Broadcasting had this podcast called Stoked about Star Trek Online. I had no idea what any of this was. I had heard rumors about a Star Trek MMO, and I was kind of interested as a Star Trek fan, but not that interested. But with closed beta invite, sure, I'll get into this. And it ended up, I set up a TeamSpeak server so that all of us from JB who had access and were going to play could talk to each other while playing, because that was something you did back then. But then the other problem was they had the Jupiter Colony forum, which was basically the website where we had all the talk about all these podcasts. All the people trying to get closed beta invites or when open beta started were just knocking this website over.
Right.
Because it was just hosted at a regular like $20 a month web hosting, shared web hosting company.
Yeah, right.
And the web hosting company tells Chris, is like, yeah, we're disabling your account because your traffic is too much for us. It's killing our server. We can rent you a dedicated server for like $400 a month, but we can't help you move all your site over to it and stuff. Chris is like, well, I just can't afford that. And I don't know how to move this stuff. And I'm like, turns out, hey, Chris, I run this company called ScaleEngine. We specialize in hosting really busy forums. And so we ended up, we convinced the ISP to unlock the account so we could get in. I downloaded all the files and dumped the database and got it all running on our system, and the site ran fine. Eventually, we added a separate forum specifically for the guild or whatever we started for all the Jupiter people playing the game. And so that's how I first dug my teeth into JB. So I was basically watching the shows and hosting the Jupiter Colony and the Jupiter Force forums. Then the server they had to host the Jupiter Broadcasting website started having a failing hard drive.
Uh-oh.
And so to save money and stuff, we moved that website over to ScaleEngine as well. And then we had been doing live video streaming by then, so we switched the live stream for JB away from Ustream to ScaleEngine. And at the time, Chris had been using a service called blip.tv to host the downloads. Because for $10 a month, they offered unlimited downloads of all your videos.
Yeah, right.
Yes, until they ran out of money.
Well, that doesn't sound...
all the videos disappeared and there was nothing to be done. Like, they went out of business hard. They didn't just be like, oh, you have to pay us now if you want to use bandwidth. It's like, actually, we overdid it and we're completely out of money and we're just gone now.
Wow.
Yeah. So we put them up on the ScaleEngine CDN. We managed to get a bunch of the older episodes and get them all posted and update the website so that people could watch the shows. And that's how basically all the downloads came from ScaleEngine. Jupiter Broadcasting paid us for those, but the live streaming we did for them as well. I participated in some of the shows, like just as a regular viewer. So like there was the faux show where we'd have like, send in a picture of your desk setup or whatever, and they'd pick the best ones or whatever. And I think I submitted a couple of things for the Stoked podcast about like, I had reverse engineered some of the math on how the weapon damage worked and stuff. And wrote some strategy guides on how to fight the Orion versus the Klingons. Nice. Turned out to be, I was putting too much thought into... I invented all these tactics, and it turns out if you just spam the button, you could win, and it didn't matter. But anyway, Then I did an interview on the Linux Action Show about FreeBSD 8, I think, when it came out. And that went pretty well. And so I ended up recording a couple of offline segments and submitted them. And they used them to pad out shows on a couple episodes where they were short on content.
Okay.
And then one day, Brian canceled it last minute. And I was around. So I ended up hosting an episode of the Linux Action Show with Chris. And then that started happening more and more often. And then there was one point where I hosted it for like months straight. But anyway, along that line, Chris and I started TechSNAP, which Chris originally envisioned as something more like No Agenda, or what ended up becoming Unfilter on Jupiter Broadcasting.
Right.
The first couple stories we covered suddenly transitioned away from things like drones and more to like Dropbox getting hacked, the Sony PSN network hack, and a bunch of this other stuff. And
so just
it kind
the
of went in
timing.
a different direction.
Right. Just the timing of it sort of set the stage, right?
Yeah. So it went a little different direction than I planned, and a lot different than Chris planned, I think. But he ended up doing Unfilter separately anyway. So yeah, then I was doing TechSNAP, and that was going really well. People were really enjoying the home server stuff and so on. And then when I was hosting the Linux Action Show, you know, my understanding of Linux was a little more vague, and most of it I'd ever used was more on the server side or even home server, whereas most of the Linux Action Show audience was about desktop.
Right.
And I wasn't really into that. And so I wasn't as popular. I think Matt Hartley ended up taking over eventually.
Okay,
but
that's true.
I did host the Linux Action Show for about 4 months straight,
Wow.
plus a lot of sporadic episodes in between. And because it was on Sunday, it was less of a scheduling thing. But again, that was ended up 2 days a week doing podcasts was sometimes a bit much.
And where did BSD Now come into that?
So yeah, after we've been doing TechSNAP for a long time, did it for 300 episodes, which is 300 weeks, which is like
crazy.
6 years, something like that. Somebody in the chat room suggested a show just about BSD. And I was like, I don't think there'd be enough content every week to do a podcast about BSD. So I challenged that person to write the show notes for the first 3 episodes.
Nice.
And if they could come up with enough stuff for 3 episodes in a short enough amount of time, then it meant there was enough stuff and we could probably do it. And it turned out there was. And TJ was our producer for the first 100-ish episodes, I think, or 150. First 100 episodes or so before he quit to get a day job.
Right.
But he did a really good job of we had an interview scheduled like every single week and all the show notes written ahead of time, and it was very nice. After that, we had JT take over. He's now does a very good job. It was a bit rough at the start because he was less familiar with BSD, but I did manage to get him a job doing BSD full time, so that helped him get to know BSD a bit better.
Right.
And so yeah, we just started it up, and I asked around, and it turned out Chris Moore was available, and he did it for the first 150 episodes. And then when he got promoted at work to being in charge of the whole FreeNAS project, he needed, he couldn't dedicate his Wednesdays to doing the podcast anymore.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have Benedict. Although it was around that time when I was having to resign from TechSNAP because of my own time limitations. And so I had asked my friend Dan to take over TechSNAP. If I had known Chris Moore was leaving BSD Now, it would have been me and Dan doing BSD Now. But it didn't work out that way. And so
life throws
after
you
asking
curveballs.
Everybody else, I got stuck with Benedict. Just kidding. Benedict was my mentor when I joined the FreeBSD project.
Okay, really? Okay. So you guys have a lot of history for sure.
I actually had 3 mentors to start because I was doing a rather complicated thing, writing a whole handbook chapter on ZFS.
Right.
But, so I had Warren Block, Benedict Reusling, and Ethan Adler.
And it sounds like the BSD project being, not as large, let's say, as some of the other projects out there. You really get to know some people quite closely.
It's funny to think about that. Technically, the Linux project, as in the kernel, is 15 people?
Fair enough.
It's Linus, and he has a bunch of subsystem lieutenants.
Fair enough.
They're the only people that can commit stuff to the repo. And actually, I think Linus does all of the commits, right? And the other people just approve things and send them to him. Well, in FreeBSD, 150 or 200 people that can have direct write access to the kernel/OS repo, and another 200 and something people that have access to the ports tree, which is our package system, to that repo, and I think about 60 or so people that do docs.
It's quite a huge web of trust, really.
Could be a larger community.
Nice.
A larger team working on the core stuff. And then, And BSD contributors is a couple thousand people, whereas Linux maybe is 10,000.
Okay.
But then again, how many people actually contribute to Linux? Although the distros make it a little different because, coming up with a set of packages and choosing the themes is technically a contribution.
Fair enough.
For a Linux distro, especially a desktop one. And, not to diminish that, that's an important contribution. So in some ways, the BSD project could technically be considered bigger than Linux in that it's the whole kernel and the whole OS. So it's all of Linux plus all of the GNU project itself, plus some other stuff and big things like the file systems, all as one project.
Right. So it just depends how you're measuring or what you're measuring or what you care about, right?
Exactly.
And that's actually one thing I'm really interested in is there's this kind of joking rivalry between Linux people and BSD people, which I think is a bit of hot fuzz. But I think there's also some misconceptions about what BSD might be and how great the community there is, and how you've said that even a lot of people who've started on Linux have gone to BSD and have loved it, and you can love both, right? It's not like it needs to be exclusive. So
no, it's like I don't hate Linux. It's just all of my experience means that when I want to do something, I know exactly how to do it on BSD, and when I try to use Linux, it's always getting in my way. Well,
and I've heard Chris, for instance, say the exact opposite, which is he just happens to have all of his experience in Linux. And so when he has a free NAS server, for instance, then he's less familiar. So there's that natural inclination to go towards
a little bit of that. But I've found that most of my Linux experience when I do build some up gets thrown away. I learned Red Hat Linux 9, or just Red Hat 9 or whatever it was called back in the day. And that stuff took me all the way up to CentOS 6, meaning that when I learned this stuff years ago, I could still apply it then. But when CentOS 7 came out, and they changed everything.
Oh, I see.
And so all my knowledge about how to configure the network went out the window. All my knowledge about this, and then all the different Linux distros. I remember when Debian broke something by changing what flags meant in CHPass on Debian and stuff. And I'm not saying that it's always bad to move fast and break things and so on, but I've found that Linux has been a lot more willing to just throw away all the built-up knowledge I have and make me learn something new.
So it's like you're losing your investment, kind of.
Yeah. Whereas all the skills I learned in FreeBSD 4 in 2002, almost all of that still applies exactly the same today in FreeBSD 12.
So you get to just keep building on top of the knowledge and building over it.
The package manager changed slightly.
Okay.
That's the main thing that's changed. So like I said, I started using BSD as a user in about 2001, 2002, and mostly was just a consumer of it and didn't really know. But it's writing the OS is much too complicated for me. But in 2006 or so, when I was just finishing college, the professor, Stefan, had mentioned, he had gone to a BSDCan, this conference in Ottawa about BSD, and it was really good. And he had learned about Varnish and Nginx and a bunch of other stuff. And so we had talked about going together some year. And then, a couple of years later, then it was oh, shit, it was last week. Or, no. It's too soon and we can't get there. And it was just kept happening. So then once we had ScaleEngine up and running, we're definitely going this year. Register, buy train tickets now. We're going. And so we did that. And so I went to my first BSDCan. And the very first presentation on the first day was Will Andrews and Justin Gibbs talking about some patches they had written for ZFS. I was like, what is this ZFS?
Right.
And they had a couple of very short slides explaining what it was. And they showed a little bit about it. So I went to this conference and met a bunch of learned a lot of cool things and got really excited about a bunch of stuff. But being my normal shy self and so on, I met 3 people.
Okay.
I saw lots of people and maybe talked to a bunch, but I only actually had in-depth conversation with maybe 3 people and didn't really meet very many people. Being me, I'd mostly just followed my business Stefan around.
Okay.
And did whatever he did kind of
Was this your first conference experience ever?
It was my first real conference experience, yes. But we had such a good time. We're we're definitely coming back next year. But then we're actually, so we were in our hotel room after the end of the last day. And we're taking the train home the next day. We're at the end of the conference, they mentioned there's this EuroBSD conference. We should submit a talk to that. why wait for next year when we can do a talk later this year? So we submitted a talk about the geographic load balancer thing that I mentioned earlier, the GDNSD thing. And that got accepted. And so then I had to rush around and get a passport, and they flew me and Stefan to Poland to give a talk at this conference. And I had a really great time and met a couple more people. So I met Michael Dexter, John Hickson, and a bunch of other people. And over dinner one of the nights at the British pub we went to in Poland, because whatever, because they had an English menu, basically. John Hickson told me that, we're having this Meet BSD conference in California, like 10 days after you get home from this. I'm like, that's a little last minute, but sure. I've had so much fun. Why not? So I hooked up and went to that and met some more people and so on. And so then after all that convinced me to sign up for Asia BSDCon next March. And in that one, Stefan came as well, but he, about halfway through the first day, he wandered off to go do touristy stuff or whatever, and I didn't see him again until the plane on the way home.
Whoa, okay.
So it helped. I don't think he did it on purpose, but it basically abandoning me helped me learn to make some friends.
Yeah, forced you to go at it on your own.
Well, I basically did what I always did. I basically latched onto Michael Dexter instead and followed him around, but he introduced me to a bunch of people, and I kind of grew into more part of the community and got more comfortable talking to people myself. And so when the next BSDCan came around, I gave a talk, which that time was the first time I gave a talk by myself. So my very first talk was Stefan and I together, and I didn't give a talk at Meet BSD or in Asia. But when the next BSDCan came around, I gave my talk about how we use Puppet and why we do bare metal instead of the cloud for ScaleEngine, mostly because it's actually cheaper for us. And on the train on the way to BSDCan in 2013, I started writing the handbook chapter on ZFS, or rewriting it, because the one that was there was bad. Like the very first thing it started with is like, here's all the custom kernel stuff you have to recompile if you want to do it on i386, which you don't. Just AMD 64, it just works. You don't have to, don't scare people away with the first paragraph.
Right.
And so basically I played with ZFS a little bit. I guess we had built the first ZFS server, which we covered in one of the early episodes of TechSNAP. That server's still running, although the pool on it got destroyed 2 weeks ago.
No way.
We trashed that pool and pulled the hard drives out because those 2 terabyte SAS drives have been running for 10 years and were
impressive.
Not if somebody would like those hard drives,
right.
They should belong in a museum because they ran 24/7 for 10 years and haven't failed.
That's amazing.
2 of them have error counts that are going up, but the other 6 are still fine. I think one of those drives is actually a replacement because one of them did fail at some point. But yes, on Twitter with Chris Fisher, actually, I was discussing the other day about how that's my oldest pool and it's just now being decommissioned. Anyway, so I had gotten into ZFS a little bit as a user and was writing the handbook chapter on the train on the way to BSDCan because I had been invited to the Developer Summit, which is an invite-only thing on the 2 days before the conference. So there are normally tutorials for regular people on that part, but I got invited to come to work with the docs people during the Developer Summit. And so I showed up with that and I learned how to do DocBook and started writing the ZFS handbook. So then when I came back the next year in 2014 is when they gave me write access to the repo, what's called my commit bit. And so then I could start actually just committing stuff directly to the docs repo.
That's a big moment, isn't it?
Instead of having to give it to someone else. And
right.
So when you get your commit bit, you're assigned one or more mentors.
Okay.
For the first so many months. Everything you do, you give to them. They approve it, then you do the committing. But if anything's wrong with it, it's their fault, not your fault.
Okay, right.
Really important for newbies, right?
Right.
It's like they didn't catch it, so it's their fault that anything was wrong, not the new person's. And that's a very important part of our community is having that mentor and that we don't yell at new people for mistakes. It's their mentor's fault for not catching it. And then eventually you're left to fly solo, and then it's your fault. So I did that. And then when I came back in 2015, I got my source commit bit for the work I had done on the installer and a couple other things. And then in 2016, just after BSDCan was the FreeBSD election. It happens every 2 years. They elect 9 people to be what's called the core team, and they basically deal with the more administrative bits of the project, like settling arguments or deciding questions and so on. And I was elected to that and then reelected again in 2018. And so I very quickly went from just a user in 2012 to docs by 2014, source in 2015, and core in 2016.
It's every year since.
Yeah.
That's good.
And then eventually, as I did more of the source stuff and learned C, I started working on ZFS directly rather than just being a consumer of it. I was starting to make fixes and add new functionality. And so I've gone to a couple of the Open ZFS developer summits and presented the work I've been working on there.
Wow. So if you look at your history from when you were just a user to all the way now, it's like you're really giving back to the community, really, right? Like it seems like you're carrying that same heart and the same love for the technology and the way it works, but you're just doing it in a completely different way that is benefiting, I would imagine, thousands
multiple
and
different
thousands.
ways. It's interesting that maybe a little bit to my chagrin that the podcast is the most impactful part of what I'm giving back rather than necessarily the code I write.
Well, do you think it's just the most visibly impactful?
Part of that, but it's, the FreeBSD project benefits from every new person we get to join the project.
Of course.
And the podcast helps with that. And
fair enough.
The conferences get better with every additional person that comes to the conference. And the podcast is attracting a lot more people to the conferences. And so, yeah.
Interesting.
I've definitely, there's a lot of good in the contributions I've made, like getting boot environments to work and improving the installer and the encrypted disk boot support. But I think the podcast has turned out to be the thing that's made the biggest difference for the project. Both in people inside the project are more aware of what else is going on in the project, but also what's going on in the neighboring projects like OpenBSD, NetBSD, Dragonfly BSD, and so on. So it's served a very powerful function for both people that are already part of the project or have been part of the project longer than me and getting new people in, which is, oftentimes one of our biggest struggles is, too many people have the imposter syndrome like I had originally of like, oh, working on the OS is much too complicated for me. It's like, I happen to start with docs, but then I was working on the installer. I'm like, well, I only do the shell script part of the installer. The C part is somebody else's problem.
But that's kind of what's cool about the OS is that you can break it down into all these teeny little pieces and then it's much more approachable, right? Like,
well, yes. And like, a big chunk of the people in FreeBSD are sysadmins first, who then became developers as they started writing more complicated sysadmin tools and stuff.
Through necessity.
So you don't have to be a developer at all or a very good one at all in order to join the project and still make very, very meaningful contributions. And, every little bit helps.
Yeah, well, you were mentioning docs, right? Like,
yes, or even just translating docs. Even if you can't write them, just translating them into, especially the languages people, like, we don't really bother with translating into Norwegian or Swedish because most people in Norway and Sweden can already read English. Like, the translation into traditional Chinese has been very valuable, and that team's done a very good job. But also, like, Brazilian Portuguese and so on. Some of these languages have a lot of demand and could help a lot to have more translators. And we're trying to make it easier for the translators. Instead of having to write docbook and so on, we're getting closer to having a markdown-like syntax that's much easier for people to just work with instead of having to spend all their time doing XML.
Right. And that way they can just get done what their skill set is. Right?
Exactly.
Oh, nice. It feels like making things easy and automating is sort of the string that ties all of your experiences together.
That's a lot of that has been what I've been after. Like some of the work I've talked about that I've never actually got around to finishing was switching a lot of the config files. Unix in general, including Linux, has always been bad for every different tool has its own different config file syntax. So in BSD, we have a universal one now called the Universal Config Language, UCL, and would like to get more and more of the tools switched over to using that. We have this concept in FreeBSD of there's a directory called etc defaults. And in it are config files you should never change that have the defaults in them. And then etc, you can override those defaults by putting your own settings. And that way, the defaults directory gets updated when you upgrade your OS, and your copy doesn't change.
Nice.
So that your settings stay. My vision going well forward would be basically a version of FreeBSD where you could basically everything could be like API driven. You control the whole machine using APIs rather than having to do anything manually. But all of it should also support being done manually, because one of the things I've always liked about FreeBSD is that there's no magic. It's very observable. You can see why and how things are happening.
Okay.
So you can always tell, there's nothing like network manager. You write the config file over here, or the network is auto-configured. Nothing's going to happen if you didn't tell it to.
So it's transparent in a way.
Yes. So it's transparent and observable.
So I would imagine for like troubleshooting, that kind of transparency is totally useful.
Yeah. So Brent and Greg, who wrote a lot of the original dtrace tools, or the newer dtrace toolkit stuff, made this nice little tweetable image of all the parts of FreeBSD and which tool you use to observe each one.
Nice.
He originally had one for Solaris, because that's what he started with. And he's built one for Linux, but there's a lot of lines flying out of it, and it's much more complicated. But
it's fascinating when you put together something like that, because it kind of tells the story of what's happening under the hood, right?
Exactly. At each layer, you can observe what's happening.
So would you say then that some of how BSD is built would be really user-friendly for someone who's just starting out?
Yes. Like in general, Unix is Unix.
Okay.
And so most of if you sit down at a shell, most people probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference right away. After a little while, you can start to see the tiny, tiny differences or whatever. But biggest one is that your shell is probably SH instead of bash, which maybe doesn't do arrays or whatever. But most Linux users, if they sat down at my FreeBSD laptop, other than the fact it's running Lumina, which is not that popular on Linux, but is available, if I just installed GNOME or KDE on it, if they sat down on my computer, they probably wouldn't be able to tell it wasn't Linux at first. Right?
You're
it's
right.
like Firefox is the same, KDE is the same, the theme is there, the command line looks the same, everything happens the same, ls works.
And so what would you say then is the biggest hurdle for people to even give it a try?
The biggest one usually is something we've been trying to work on for FreeBSD, is kind of a Rosetta Stone, a translation guide. It's like, instead of apt get install foo, use package install foo, or...
But that's not dissimilar to moving to a different distribution, for instance, right?
So in general, I think the biggest thing people will find surprising if they sat down at a fresh install of FreeBSD is that there are 0 packages installed. The operating system is basically kept separate from what we call the third-party packages.
Okay.
While there are a bunch of applications installed, they are what are part of the OS, and they live in /USR and user bin and so on.
Got it.
Then everything you install yourself, like if you install Vim instead of the NVI that comes by default, or if you install a Windows system or whatever, those all get based in user local and then the directory. So the config file is user local etc samba, and the binary is user local sbin samba or whatever. And this way of separating that means that something goes wrong with it, your OS is fine, or you upgrade your OS and your packages separately.
Interesting.
And so unlike if you upgrade Ubuntu, I'm going to install the next version of Ubuntu or the next update for it to get the security updates. It's actually also changed the version of a bunch of the tools I'm using. That's annoying.
Which may have caused some unexpected consequences. Yeah.
Now, they've worked pretty hard to prevent that. But in FreeBSD, the OS is on this side of the fence, and it's controlled by the FreeBSD tools, and the local applications are on this side and controlled by the package manager, and that's kind of your domain. And so, the OS is always separate, and it means it's easy to upgrade the OS and not the packages, or the packages and not the OS. Some
of what I've appreciated about what I've learned about BSD and OpenBSD from you and from other places is some of the real thought that has gone into the process. And so it takes a different approach in many ways, but there's always quite a well thought out reason for the structure. But even, for instance, if you even look at the mentorship structure, it's kind of brings that same intention in that it's not just willy-nilly. It's like, okay, well, we have a way of doing it because it produces in the long run far better results.
Yes. I think the biggest one is something we call POLA on FreeBSD, which is the policy of least astonishment. So when the sysadmin upgrades from FreeBSD 11 to FreeBSD 12, they know some things are going to change. What does change should be the least astonishing option to them. It shouldn't be a surprise. It shouldn't be that, suddenly this command does the opposite of what it did before. Or that, some setting you had is just the opposite now. And so we try to make it so that there's a smooth transition and the user decides what changes, and we try not to change things by them on them by default and so on.
Right.
I don't know if it still makes sense nowadays, but basically the versioning scheme can be confusing to people. So like we have FreeBSD 11.3 is the current version. 11.3 just came out a couple months ago, and 11.2 goes end of life, I think, at the end of October. Anything you compile to work on FreeBSD 11.any version will work on all FreeBSD 11s. The ABI that the binary uses to talk to the kernel is guaranteed not to change. But when you go to 12, that's when we change it, and those major versions. On Linux, it's a little different. I think they basically they try not to change the binary interface, but instead constantly add new versions of things. So when they got 64 inodes, instead of just updating the stat syscall, they made stat 64 and so on. It has pros and cons, but it can be confusing because, for example, FreeBSD 12 came out and then FreeBSD 11.3 came out.
Right.
So 11.3 is newer, and has some newer fixes and stuff that aren't in 12.
Right.
But 12 has some features that couldn't go into 11 because they would break the ABI.
Makes sense.
So we're looking at possibly actually renaming that. So we would call it, FreeBSD 11 Update 3 or something, so that it's clear that upgrading from FreeBSD 11.2 to 11.3 is really just installing your security patches kind of thing, not the same as upgrading major versions where, everything changes.
Right. I want to say, first of all, thanks so much for your time. This has been a real pleasure. And also to chat with a fellow Canadian is always a treat. Is there somewhere you'd like to send people if they want to get connected with you?
Probably the easiest way, if you want to reach me, is just Twitter. I'm Allan Jude, ALLANJUDE, or on the Jupiter Broadcasting IRC. I'm always idling there, so you can always ping me there if you want interactive or whatever. And check out BSDNow.tv. Even if you're not really into BSD, there's lots to learn. It's a great way to start bridging that gap. And with that, we take usually about 3 viewer questions each episode. So if you have any questions about BSD or anything like that, if you write into feedback@bsdnow.tv, then we will try to answer your questions on the show.
And you do the show live, right?
We do it live every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, which is 1600 UTC. Watch out for the daylight savings change. Europe will be offset by an hour and North America won't. So the show time here won't change, but for people in Europe, it will change for a little bit for those 2 weeks of stupidity. Now that the podcast is audio only, we still stream video just of our faces. We don't do the whole showing the website thing anymore. But if you go to bsdnow.tv/live, the ScaleEngine DVR feature is set up so that you can watch the live stream of the last episode we recorded on the website right up to the minute where we start recording the next one and it gets replaced.
Nice.
So using the DVR buffer, you can pause and rewind the live show while it's playing, or show up after the show and watch the whole thing as if it was live with fast forward if you want.
Cool. You'll never know it wasn't live.
Basically.
So one question I think might be kind of interesting to ask you is there something you'd like the community to do or to think about or take action on, or some kind of ask, I suppose?
If you haven't given BSD a try, you might just give it a try.
Yeah, that seems like a logical place to go. And I know there was a few people in the Jupiter Broadcasting IRC who were hemming and hawing, and you and I are on there saying, no, just try. Just show up for the show, at least learn a little bit and give it a try. There is lots of opportunity with BSD, so why not?
Yeah, and even if you just want to tune in for the feedback section near the end where we answer ZFS questions, because it turns out ZFS works on all the operating systems now.
Right.
Jürgen Lundman has a version you can install on Windows 10, and it works.
Well, thank you again so much for chatting, and I hope we get to connect again soon.
Thanks for arranging this and coming all the way out here.
Of course. Thanks for inviting me into your home. It's great.